Over the last month or so, with all that's been sort of rocking the country, um, there's a saying that keeps coming back to me, uh, which is that there are some decades in which nothing happens, and then there's some weeks in which decades happen. And I think that's been true of the last couple of weeks. That is, that a nation whose fragility and inequality and racial differences actually got sort of unveiled by the COVID crisis, something that indicated how precarious employment can be, how different people were in terms of assets and uh, access to digital resources, uh, the very nature of people having legal status or not in the country. And then on top of that, excuse me, the murder of George Floyd, uh, beginning to unveil systemic problems of racism in policing, but also systemic problems of racism in so many other systems that structure life chances in the United States of America. And while these are weeks in which decades have been happening, and it's also true that there has been decades in which work has been done to sort of bubble up these issues and for these issues to come forward. So, what I want to talk about today is a little bit about how the times are changing, why racial equity matters, and why this has actually been going on for a bit longer than most people think. So, first, one of the important things to realize is that the United States is changing demographically. This is a chart showing you that the United States as a whole will become majority people of color by about the year 2045, sort of the middle of that decade. And this is something that has filled some people with great fear about what's happening to America. It's filled other people with great delight about the diversity that that will bring to America. But a lot of both the fear and the delight have not always been driven by a careful look at the data as to what's really going on. Because when people see that demographic change occurring in the United States, most people tend to think that what's driving it is immigration. But in fact, immigration has actually slowed down dramatically into the United States. And this is well before the presidency of Donald Trump. This just shows you the share of immigrants in the United States between 1990, and 2016. There really was a pretty big jump in terms of the share of immigrants between 1990 and about 2006, from about 8% to about 12.5% of the United States. But as you can see, between 2006 and 2016, that jump was only by about 1 percentage point of the US population. Why is that? Immigration in the United States is actually slowing down. And what's been slowing down in particular has been the share of the undocumented population, something about which there's been great anxiety, but not a whole lot of real information. So this shows you that the unauthorized population or undocumented immigrants in the United States actually peaked in about the year 2007, fell pretty dramatically in the years 2007 through 2009 as the recession hit, and actually began a fall starting about 2015, which is pretty much stabilized right now. And a lot of that is simply that things have changed in most of the major sending countries. Most importantly, something most people do not realize is that net migration from Mexico is actually negative. There are more Mexicans returning to Mexico than coming to the United States in this current era. And that has very little to do with enforcement at the border. It's got a lot more to do with the fact that the fertility rates in Mexico have changed dramatically. It used to be over the course of her lifetime, a Mexican woman would have 5 children. That was about 30, 40 years ago. Now the fertility rate for Mexican women is about 2.3, 2.2. The fertility rate in the United States is about 1.7. As those two come together, there's less of a long-term push factor. And also, the Mexican economy has been doing better. So we've actually seen the undocumented population fall in the United States, although the anxiety about that undocumented population has certainly risen. And when you look at the immigration flows more generally, now there's more immigrants coming from Asia than from Latin America. So where is the demographic change actually coming from? The demographic change in the United States is mostly coming actually from the change in the youth population. Many of them sons and daughters of immigrants, but not always so. So between 2000 and 2017, the number of young whites, non-Hispanic whites under the age of 18, actually fell by nearly 7 million. Now, I always like to reassure my audiences that this does not mean that 7 million young white people died. We might have noticed that. And my joke is that there would have been a lot less demand for avocado toast if we had seen actually such a decline in the youthful white millennial population. What's really going on is that there's less whites entering into 1 and 2 that is being born than exiting that cohort by becoming 19 and 20. So you can see there's also been a slight decline in the black population. I'll complicate that in a minute. There's been a big jump in the Latino youth population and a big jump in the Asian population and a big jump in the population that designates themselves as multiracial. So what's going on is that, in particular, the youth population is changing. And we are seeing this in the streets in terms of the peaceful protests that have occurred around the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent protest of policing in America as we know it. That those crowds have not, they've been very young, they've been overwhelmingly peaceful, and they've not been overwhelmingly black. They've actually been quite multiracial because of a younger generation that's growing up in a much more diverse situation and is able to do something that people like my age who are older are not able to do, which is to hold two ideas in your head at the same time. One, that America is much more diverse and your friend group, particularly if you're young, is more likely to include people, if you're white, who are black or Latino or Asian, or if you're black, to include white friends, etc. And second, that at the same time that your friend group might be more diverse, that there's actually systematic ways in which people of color, particularly Black Americans, are disadvantaged. So the ability to understand that diversity is occurring and that we have new friends, but at the same time that there's systems built in that disadvantage groups over time. Now, around that Black population, it's important to understand that the decline in the young white population is pretty much real. There's been a shift of young whites declaring themselves multiracial, but you can see for the Black population in particular, there's been a huge group of folks who probably in the past who were African American would have simply designated themselves as Black on the census, who are now claiming multiracial heritage. What does that look like in Tennessee and in Chattanooga? You're actually lagging the rest of the country in terms of your demographic change. You can see your demographic change in the state of Tennessee from 1980 going to the year 2050, in which you'll still be about 2/3 white, distinct from the rest of the country. But you can see you've got a very stable share of the Black population, a growing share of Latinos, and a growing share of Asians. In Chattanooga, lagging a little bit in the past, but likely to actually accelerate faster than the state of Tennessee generally. And also what's important to realize is where currently your population growth is coming from in both Tennessee and we'll see in a second in Chattanooga. So what this shows you is for the 1980s, the 1990s, and the period 2000 to the most recent data we had 2013 to 2017, what is the sort of increase in the population and where is it coming from? So in the 1980s, the bulk of your population growth was coming from that gray bar, non-Hispanic white. In the 1990s, the majority, but not like the vast bulk, was coming from the population that's white. But from 2000 to 2013, 2017, the bulk or the majority of your population growth in Tennessee is actually coming from people of color. That is the Black population, Latino and Asian population in particular, which are growing in the state. Now, that's a lot of interesting demographics. At least I hope you like demographics. If you don't like demographics, you probably should tune out and come back later because a lot of this is about demographics. But the most interesting thing to me about demographics is not just sort of the ethnic change, but trying to break down that ethnic change also by age. And what you can see when you look at the age distribution of ethnic groups in Chattanooga in this particular chart is the very significant difference by age. So the median age, meaning half are older, half are younger, for the white population in Chattanooga is 43. The median age for Asian Pacific Islanders and African Americans is about 35. And the median age for Latinos is 25. The Latino population is a very young population. And that 43 to 25 is 18 years. That's a generation gap in terms of its understanding. And I'll get back to that racial generation gap in a minute. It's something that's been very profound in the rest of the country. But let me go on to what all of this means economically. But let me summarize, because like any good professor, you need to summarize midway to make sure that people are understanding what you're saying. There are decades when nothing happens. There are weeks when decades happen, but beneath those weeks are decades of change. And the big decades of change have been this demographic shift in the United States, which has provoked fear in some people, but at the same time has provoked a change, particularly for young people, in which they understand that diversity is part of their life and that they will have friends and coworkers and colleagues who come from different walks of life. But as I mentioned, that in particular for young people, which I think is difficult, and it seems to me for a lot of older people to understand at the same time that that might be the case, that there's also systematic ways in which people of color, particularly African Americans, are not able to make economic advances and social advances and find themselves in different relationships with the police in terms of the level of fear that they might have rather than the level of comfort and safety that seeing a police officer might provoke for many white Americans. So let's look at a little bit at some of those differences. So this is, again, Chattanooga, and this is the percent of families falling below 150% of the federal poverty line. Why are economists like myself focusing more on 150% of the poverty line than the poverty line? Because the poverty line for a family of 4 in the United States right now, the official federal poverty line is about $26,000. That's not just poor, that's like really damn poor. And so that makes it very difficult for people to eat, pay rent, be able to get by, particularly in higher cost areas, but even in lower cost areas like Tennessee and Chattanooga. So economists generally now are looking at 150% of that poverty line to say that's really what we should be thinking about in terms of what it means to be poor. In Chattanooga, about 14% of the white population falls below that income level in terms of being poor, but that's about 35% of the Black population and 40% of the Latino population. You'll see for the Latinos that there was not available for the period 1990. That does not mean that there was not a single Latino in Chattanooga in 1990. I'm sure they were, and they might have even been related to me. But what that does mean is that that population size was so small that our statistics about it, particularly in terms of determining their income level, wasn't reliable enough by the standards that we use to give you a poverty level for there. But you could see there that there's a big disparity with 2 to 2.5 times the poverty rate in Black and Latino communities that there is in white communities. What is driving that? There are a couple of things that I think are important. One is something that everyone tends to go to, and I hope that you're all working on, I'm sure you are, is the issue of education. When you have different educational profiles, you will do differently in the labor market. I'm going to show you in a minute that education is not the only explanatory factor here. And so it means there's a lot of work for people to do in your businesses and in your civic leadership. But you can see here, looking at the educational attainment of people of working age, 25 to 64, that there's quite a difference in terms of educational achievement, with about 31% of white folks in Chattanooga Metro having a BA or higher, but with that number being 17 and 18% for Latinos, and the number in particular for folks who have less than a high school degree being much higher for both African Americans and Latinos. That's going to mean a difference in terms of wages. But the other thing that's going on is that we are increasingly baking that educational inequality in when we look at how we're doing schooling in the United States. So this is a chart looking at the share of kids by ethnic group that are in what are called high poverty schools. High poverty schools are schools in which more than 75% of the kids are on free or reduced price lunches. Now, not all high poverty schools are bad. My kids actually went to high poverty schools by these definitions. My wife taught in them. We thought, even though our incomes were higher, that it was responsible to put our kids into the same schools that my wife taught in, and into places. We're great believers in public schools. Both of them and many of their cohort went on to do well. My kids actually both went to UCLA. Of course, one turned out to be a musician whose backup career is as an actor, and the other is a yoga instructor. So not sure what UCLA actually did, but and nonetheless, they were quite smart and did well coming out of those schools. But we do know that in general, high poverty schools are schools where there are challenges in terms of teacher quality, attracting the best possible teachers, challenges in terms of additional resources, et cetera. And if you look at this chart in the Chattanooga metropolitan area, about a fifth of white kids are in high poverty schools, but nearly 2/3 of Black and Latino kids are in high poverty schools. So the sort of educational inequality you saw in that earlier chart, it's actually being baked in to this educational profile going forward. And we know that education, as important as it is, doesn't always do the trick in terms of persistent discrimination in labor markets. What this shows you is the median wages by education level for that same age cohort, 25 to 64. This is for Tennessee, not Chattanooga, because we needed a larger population sample to be able to get reliable breakdowns by race and by educational level. But you could see that at each and every educational level, there is a wage penalty for being African American or being Latino. And what research shows, careful statistical research, is that there is indeed in labor markets an educational penalty for being Black, that there remains discrimination in terms of who the businesses look for in terms of resumes. And there's a very interesting experiment that was done by the University of Chicago economists in which they simply changed the name on an identical resume from what they thought were white sounding names to Black sounding names. And white names got a 50% higher callback based on exactly the same resume. These kind of unconscious biases, probably in that case somewhat conscious, give people different entry ways to being able to obtain jobs and being able to garner wages. So this is the reality we need to deal with. And one of the ways in which this is particularly significant and then gets sort of hidden in places that have dynamic economies is the following. Take a minute with this chart. This chart's important. This chart is whether you were born in Tennessee and live in Chattanooga, whether you live in Chattanooga but you were born in another state, whether you live in Chattanooga or you were born in another country, and then what's your educational level. One thing you're going to see here is that for the population in Chattanooga, 22% of those born in Tennessee who live in Chattanooga have a bachelor's degree. But the out-of-state folks who came to Chattanooga, born someplace else, 37% of them have a bachelor's degree. Therefore, when you look at the good jobs you're generating, a lot of them may wind up being held by people who are born out of state, often out of country, and you instead are not doing as well by your homegrown. And by the way, in Chattanooga, this is particularly so for your younger population, looking at the group 25 to 34 of that dynamic young part of your professional economy. The US born out of state, 43% have a BA, only 25% of the homegrown have a BA. That means that you may be growing dynamic, cool jobs, but they may not be being held by people coming out of your own educational institutions. So that's a lot of worrisome news around inequity, but the really good news is the following, that there's been a sort of fundamental realization that's going on, I think, around the country, but it's been bubbling up for a long time about the corrosive effects of inequality and inequity. We can understand that now that when you have a community that perceives tremendous inequality in policing, it's going to make policing less effective. But it's also come out to be the case that when there's tremendous inequality in terms of the economy, that actually makes economies less prosperous. Now, that's not what we always taught in economics when we first were doing this years ago. We often thought that inequality, liberals might not like it, but it might be good for economic growth because it generates savings and incentives for investment and the ability for an economy to grow. And that's probably true at an extreme. If you're in the Soviet Union, you eliminated all income differences, you're not going to have a dynamic economy. But you can go too far to the other side, where so much money is locked up in too few hands that you don't have enough consumer demand to drive the economy forward. You're not getting the kinds of investments in public education that lead to a productive workforce, and you're getting the kinds of social conflicts that don't allow you to agree on a growth model. And increasingly, this is what research is showing. And it's not just people like myself who are professors from California. It's also places like the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland that found out that places that are more unequal, more residentially segregated by race, more fragmented, tend not to be able to grow over time. We looked at this in a book called Equity, Growth, and Community, put out a few years ago, in which we looked at these issues of inequality, racial disparities, and prosperity. And we found out that inequality and social distance are key dragging factors on the ability to sustain growth over time. We went beyond that, and this is where I'll end, to ask the question, what are metropolitan areas that are actually able to do better, that are able to promote equity and close racial and income gaps, and actually also generate sustained prosperity over time? We found out that those areas were not always what you would expect. Some of them were red politically, some of them were blue politically, but they had three characteristics that mattered. The first was that they tended to create regional dialogues. They tended to create the opportunity for people from different sectors to come together. One of those places, Salt Lake City, which has had a tremendous set of institutions that are really private, bringing people together to talk about the future of the metropolitan region that Salt Lake City anchors. And partly as a result of it, they've helped create something called the Utah Compact, which has created a more welcoming attitude toward immigrants. One thing people don't know about Salt Lake is slated to become majority people of color before the rest of the country does, sometime in 2035, 2040, partly because they've been so welcoming to immigrants. Second thing that we found that mattered is valuing conflict as well as collaboration, realizing that if tough issues of inequity are going to get to the table, that they'll get there through protests and not just through peaceful or polite dialogue. We are talking about police reform right now because we all witnessed a brutal murder and because there's peaceful protests on the street raising issues that are forcing political figures and civic figures to take some account of. So we need to understand that conflict actually plays a role in bringing about collaboration. That's the story of San Antonio, Texas. Also, what's important is data, dialogue, and determination. That is, that we need to root our conversations in data and have facts at hand to be able to, I hope that this kind of a PowerPoint is part of doing that, of making sure that you've got some data about the changes that are coming, about the inequalities that are persistent, so that when you're thinking about diversity, you're not just thinking about the friend group, but you're thinking about the systemic and structural differences that exist and could lead to persistent inequality over time, and how do we address them. So let me close with this. There are big changes that have been afoot so far. There are bigger changes that lie ahead. Our economy is going to be fundamentally restructured as a result of the COVID crisis in ways that we can't even anticipate, in terms of more remote work, in terms of the expansion of the care and health economy, in terms of the expansion of logistics and in demand, in terms of a wide number of economic shocks. And we're also got big changes in terms of race relations, because I think it's impossible to go back from what we've seen in terms of both understanding persistent disparities and understanding that young people, they're not putting up with it anymore. And those are young people of every racial group. And if we address that, we're going to need to center racial and economic equity. And we're going to need to make sure that equity is not just sprinkled on, that it's not just something that we talk about after we generate economic growth, but it's something that must be baked in to the economic strategies that we derive in the first place. And in doing this, we should expect some challenges along the way. So let me pull out of the slides and close with a story by first stopping the share. And I'll just close with this story. Some of what I've talked about, I hope, actually, was challenging. I hope that some of what I talked about was provoking, and will lead you to have some realizations and some conversations. I hope that for the following reasons. I wish I was with you in person, because there's a question I often ask people when I talk in person. I ask people to raise their hands. Hard to do this virtually. I say, how many of you go to the gym? Some hands go up. Then I say, how many of you go to the gym every once in a while? A lot of hands go up. And I tell folks, well, you know, if you go to the gym every once in a while, and you know this, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to drop weights on your feet. You're going to strain your muscles. To the people around you, it's going to be obvious that you're making mistakes, but they're probably not going to help you because they don't see you at the gym very much. They don't know who you are. Looks like you're probably out there to actually learn a lot. And so you probably will stop going back to the gym because it's been an unpleasant, hurtful, and unhelpful experience. But if you go to the gym every day, then you get into a routine. You get a little bit better with the muscles that you're exercising. People start to come over and say, you know what, you should use that machine in a slightly different way. You'll get a better workout, and they'll say it with kindness. That's a little bit like not talking about race and racism every day. If you make it part of your conversation and say, am I talking about diversity? Am I talking about equity? Am I talking about inclusion? And am I talking about the systematic things I can change? And am I bringing that up every day or at least every week rather than just once a year? Your muscles will get stronger. When you make mistakes, people will understand that you've been trying, and they will be there to help you, and they will be kinder as you make your way to a more perfect union. Thank you. I'll turn things over to Darian to see if that created any questions.
Yes, we do have a question. What are some things organizations can do to begin those baby steps of reforming or getting better at showing their ability to make that change?
So I think part of it is what I just said. What are the things and conversations that you're having your staff do, your employees do, to be able to think about both attitudes? Because we often think about racism as a set of attitudes rather than a set of structures that affect people's lives. Because, you know, if you had a set of really bad attitudes, but it didn't affect the way the police operated or the way that someone got a job interview, then I think, you know, it's a shame that you've got those attitudes. But if those attitudes don't have power attached to them, they're really not quite as worrisome. So I think having those conversations within businesses themselves. I think the second thing, and this is a little bit harder, Darian, but I think it's important, is really systematically examining who's in the leadership of your business, firm, or organization, and have you made every effort to make sure that you're seeing the talent in people, coaching the talent in people, and bringing them forward? And are you also taking, I was about to say taking a chance, but I'm having an insight when you're doing hiring. I run a research center. We've currently got about 21 people working for me, but we, you know, go through employees like everybody else. We have a fair amount of stability, but there's quite a number of people who've done very well, I must say, who I've hired who were not thought initially to perhaps have the skills on paper, but there was something you could see in the way that they thought, in the way that they acted, in the talent that they had, that was something that could be coached and mentored and structured to the excellence that was actually residing within them. So have the conversations, figure out who you want to lift up to be a leader, and then also figure out where you can see the talent. Last thing I'll say, the most important thing we can all do is listen. I can't really know what it's like to be Black and see the police. I have an inkling of it because some of that kind of stuff has happened to me as a Latino. I have an inkling of it because of lots of friends I've got who have that experience and have those reflexes, but I don't sit inside it. But when I listen to people, then I can sit inside it and not come up with excuses to explain away their experience, but understand that this is indeed what they feel and it is indeed what they experience.
Dr. Pastor, another question out of the chat. How does Chattanooga compare to other cities in the U.S. with similar makeup and population? Or have you done that research?
Well, one thing I would recommend to you is the tool that I mentioned a few slides back in terms of data. It's something called the National Equity Atlas. It's run by my research shop in PolicyLink, which is a policy intermediary in Oakland.
And the National Equity Atlas has data on 150 biggest metropolitan areas in the United States. It's got the top 100 cities, obviously all 50 states, and the United States as a whole. We've got data on demographics. We've got data on economic disparities by race. We've got data on air pollution exposures by race, obesity. We've got one of the charts that I showed you in terms of the disparities of the kids' experience in terms of schools. And we also have something that's really important, which is what would the economic gains be if you close the racial disparities in your region? So how does Chattanooga rank against all of that? Your demographic change is slower, as I mentioned, than many other places in the country. However, there are a couple things that I think are pretty worrisome for Chattanooga. One is that your segregation of kids by race in terms of high poverty schools is larger than a lot of other parts of the United States. Second, your that one of the reasons I brought that chart out about how your homegrown are doing versus your out-of-staters, that's a lot bigger than in a lot of metropolitan regions of the United States. Why that's important for a business audience is because you will often think your economy is doing well if you've created a lot of professional middle-class jobs that are attracting creative class people to come to your city. But a very few of them actually were born in your city. It's not clear what you're doing for your city. You might be doing something for the economy, but you want to be doing something for our economy.
That makes a lot of sense. And that I've said that a few times. Another question out of the chat. How will the rise of mixed families change the growth of other and mixed race numbers as the city grows, as a socioeconomic group?
That is such a good question. So one thing that's been surprising to us, and I guess this gets to the whole two ideas in your head at the same time. Since the mixed race category was first put on the census in 2000, most of us expected, excuse me, that mixed race category to grow pretty dramatically over time. Because most of our experiences are that there's a lot more interethnic couples than in the past, and therefore many more biracial or biethnic children. What's been interesting is that it has grown less rapidly than we thought. And I think that's because there's a lot of particularly biracial black, white kids who feel like, well, yes, I'm biracial, but when I'm seen, I'm treated as though I'm black. That only one part of who I am is what is seen by police or teachers or employers. And so that seems to be something that's going on. But to get to what might be underlying that question is there definitely a lot more interethnic marriages and children who have parents of different races or ethnicities. And I think the kind of fantastic thing about that has been that there's an understanding of the complexity of identity, that it can't simply be reduced to one thing. And I do think that it's creating many more situations in which your own friend and family, your own immediate family circle might not contain someone who is undocumented, but once you reach into your cousins, maybe one of them married someone who was a dreamer, whose life just got protected by that Supreme Court ruling earlier this week. And the joy that person is feeling might be the joy that you feel as a family member. So I think a lot of that is going on, and it does help to create deeper understanding.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Dr. Pastor. It's been great having you. If you want to leave our audience with any one particular thing, what would it be?
Well, first, let me thank you. You gave me an opportunity to wear the first button-down shirt I have in a long time because I do a lot of speaking in California, and even virtually we can wear a t-shirt, but I realized, Darren, you'd probably be wearing a tie, so I wanted to dress up for you with at least a button-down shirt. So, but I think the thing that I would leave the audience with is that being agitated is not a bad thing. Finding yourself worried and concerned about uncomfortable conversations and how they might make their way into your business, it's not a bad thing. Finding yourself confronted about your own attitudes and having to rethink them, not a bad thing. Change happens at the growing edge. And the growing edge happens when we're pushing ourselves to exercise those muscles in new and different ways. So I hope that diversity will be your hallmark. I hope that inclusion will be a guidepost, but I hope that equity, making sure that people are treated fairly, that people are given the tools they need to be able to succeed, that translates into equity, into assets and ownership, small business, and power over people's lives, that equity will be the metric by which you judge your success. Thank you.